Hey guys, it's Monday for you guys. It's me, English faculty member, Mr. Eshoff. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes for you today about a couple of the poems in that packet. Now that we're diving into their meaning a bit more, following your unscrambling of them and/or your scavenging through them. And I've also posted on our lesson plan today the answer key for those scavenger hunts, so you'll get a chance to compare your notes and your answers to those in the scavenger hunt and see how well you did. Okay, but let's talk for a couple minutes just about two of the poems in the packet, and I've chosen these two selectively. As I mentioned last week, I just had my grandmother's memorial service, and so I chose a couple poems that resonate pretty powerfully with me in this time. And because I'm the teacher, I get to decide which ones we talk about. And so I'm talking about these two. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you here and show you which two I want to talk about today. First one is kind of a given, Grandmother's Song. This is by Nellie Wong. Nellie Wong is a contemporary poet. She lives in Oakland, where she was born and raised, and it's actually a lot of artistic and cultural places and landmarks in Oakland that she's kind of featured in as an artist, and I know there are buildings that are kind of named after her. So she actually has quite the presence there in a very cultural sort of revival moment for Oakland. I know she's been a big part of that in the last decade or so. Anyway, this is a grandmother's song. Remember, this is a pantoum. They pantoum, so they repeat the second and fourth lines of this first stanza, the first and third lines of this stanza, and then the second and fourth lines of the second stanza become the first and third line of these stanzas, so on and so on. Remember, one of the things we said about pantoums, as far as what the form allows poets to do, is number one, to evoke the passage of time, or in some cases, the non-passage of time, right? Because you have this repetitive cycle that is not bound by number of stanzas, so long as you're doing that repetition cycle. It's a pantoum, no matter how many stanzas you ultimately have. And so poets do tend to use this form to write about time, or the passage of time, or the lack of passing of time for whatever reason, when they write pantoums. And we certainly see this in Grandmother's Song, which is about these grandmothers, or these grandmothers, plural, immigrant experiences in this country, and how they're forced to sort of bond and connect with their grandchildren in new and maybe difficult ways, given that they're now in a place that they're not familiar with. So we think about how the pantoum form might help convey some of those themes. It certainly makes sense, right? That time is something that a grandmother might value with her grandchildren. It's also something that a grandmother or a grandparent might struggle with, knowing that as they get older, as their grandchildren get older, maybe there's a disconnect in the relationship as the kids grow older, or maybe you feel like you are too far removed from the prime of your life in order to have a good relationship with them. Maybe so much of your life is now but a memory, and so you feel like you're clinging to things from the past. And so you think about why a pantoum for a poem about an aging grandmother. Maybe it makes sense, right? That the passing of time is a very salient, very powerful, and a very poignant thing to reflect on for somebody who is quite elderly. In addition to that, I think, I don't know if this is something that Nellie Wong intentionally chose the pantoum for this poem, but if we think about the rhyme scheme here and how these lines of rhyme are alternating lines, right? So song, long, raised days, rings, things. I think there's something in here, in this choice of pantoum, about the generational relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. if you think about relationships within your family, I do think it's true that so often the grandchildren have better relationships with the grandparents than the parental generation in between. And there are lots of logistical reasons for this, that there's no discipline really involved when the grandparents are here. Maybe there's drama or history between grandparent and parent that is difficult. Maybe there's drama and conflict between parent and child that is difficult. But for whatever reason, I think Nellie Wong is celebrating here the unique power of the grandparent-grandchild relationship. It's like the first generation rhymes with the third generation, and the second generation in the middle is the one that gets left out a little bit. And if we're looking at a rhyme scheme of a poem in which the first line rhymes with the third line, the second line rhymes with the fourth line, there's this inherent sense of like skipping or genes being recessive in that structure of rhyming. And maybe this is something that you can relate to. I know I can absolutely relate to it with my mom's grandparents who are celebrating this weekend. My mom does not have a great relationship with her parents, or especially her now deceased mom. My relationship with my mom's parents is much better than my mom's was, and there are just certain things that happen between parent and child that leave some pretty deep scars sometimes emotionally, and a lot of those wounds or those difficulties are rectified in the next generation. And I think Nellie Wong chooses to write about this relationship because it can be a very powerful one for a lot of people. And if you're thinking about the immigrant experience specifically, which Nellie Wong is diving into here, I think maybe there's an extra powerful connection being made by a poet or by a speaker to reflect on like the last generation of his or her family to not be an immigrant, which in this case would be the grandparents. So maybe that there's an added sense of intrigue or special connection there, because for the grandchildren, it's the grandmother's generation that represents like the last full generation that was not American. In this case, that was still Chinese. Yes, that's grandmother's song. Really pretty pantoum, fairly simple, right? Just a lot of really strong imagery. The sun's rays, gold bracelets, opal rings, sort of all these artifacts being visualized or being referenced. All of these pieces that sort of are pulled together to represent what we think of when we think of grandma, or at least what we think of when we think of Nellie Wong's grandma. Sprinkled with Peking dust, certainly a reference, I think, to how sometimes our grandparents love to hold on to the old ways, the old traditions. Peking is the sort of the older, more retro, archaic name for Beijing, capital city of China. So my sense here is that the grandmothers still are thinking in the old school form of Peking as opposed to Beijing, signifying that there's this older, more historical mindset in the minds of the grandparents than there are in their grandchildren, right? And again, they are the last bastion. They are the historical signifier of all things past in China, and they're using that maybe to try to establish a connection with their grandchildren who are now in a new place for the first time. All right, so that's grandmother's song, really good one. The other one I want to look at is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which is about losing things. We've talked a little bit about Elizabeth Bishop in class already, but this is another one of her best, or at least one of my favorites of hers. This is villanelle. Okay, so we'll see how she uses the villanelle form a bit. And remember that villanelle is the repeated use of this first line of the poem, and then this third line of the poem in the subsequent stanzas and their end lines. And she does mess with this a little bit. As you see, really the only thing she's repeating from the third line here is disaster. Disaster here, disaster here, disaster here, disaster here, which as a word to choose to reinforce and emphasize, it's a pretty impactful one. So she's writing about the art of losing not being hard to master. And already, I think in the first line, we should be struck by what she's going to be talking about. We don't tend to think of losing things as an art form or as a skill. It's something that happens to all of us, but we don't really frame it as being an artistic pursuit. And so we're already getting something fairly unique here in that Elizabeth Bishop is trying to maybe alter our thinking about the way we deal with losing things in our lives. And the fact that it isn't hard to master, I think is her argument initially that because every person deals with loss at some point, we should all be able to figure out how to deal with it, right? Or more complicatedly, this is the speaker trying to tell herself that she should be able to figure out how to deal with loss, because I'm not sure this is Elizabeth Bishop poet's argument, but I do think this is the speaker of this poem, which very likely could be Liz Bishop, telling herself that because everybody deals with loss, I should be able to figure out how to deal with it too. This skill is not a very difficult one to master, right? It's like writing an AP Lit essay. It's a piece of cake, right? It's an art that isn't hard to master. So that's her opening salvo at us. We know Liz Bishop had a lot of heartache in her life. She had a lover or partner commit suicide, and given our knowledge of her biography, this poem was written soon after she broke up with one of her other lovers, although they did end up getting back together. So although she loses things here, we do know that there is a happy ending, at least to this part of her story. Anyway, so you have this idea that the art of losing isn't hard to master. And notice the building of like the intensity of the things that she loses, right? We start with a door key. We can all relate to that one. An hour badly spent, right? Wasted time. Okay, we've all done that. Sure, right? We're still in this, I think, mode of acceptance. We're like, yeah, really easy to misplace your car keys. Really easy to waste some time, Liz. We get it, right? And then we start to pick up some momentum here. And I think the rhyme that she chooses to use as her central rhyme helps with this idea that things kind of unravel quickly. Faster, disaster, fluster, master, faster, disaster, laster, master, faster, disaster. Right? It's an easy rhyme to feel like you're going through expediently or quickly. That S sound, that AS sound, kind of gives some snappiness to this poem. So we're losing further and losing faster. Places, names, where it was you were meant to travel. Okay, now we're getting a little bit more important, right? I see my boss in the hallway. I don't remember his name. That's not good, right? I see a friend. And the friend says, "Oh my gosh, right, Mr. Eshoff, like English faculty member, we're so happy to see you." And I'm like, "You are," right? And boom, there goes that friendship. Okay, so some of these things now become a little bit more meaningful when we lose them, and we're starting to gain a little bit more intensity as far as dealing with the things that we lose. Mother's watch, that's not good. Oh shoot, now I lost a house. That's really not good. Okay. Oh shoot, I've lost cities. I've lost loved ones. 2 rivers, a continent. Okay, now we're getting some pretty significant stuff. I don't really know how one loses a continent, but I think what she's trying to articulate or to help us visualize here is that in maybe the mind of the speaker, you're trying to justify or you're trying to equate your loss with any other type of loss, right? All losses here are created equal, maybe is something you might say the speaker is looking to articulate here. I think the stanza form of the villanelle really helps with that, right? Like this stanza looks like this stanza, looks like this stanza, looks like this stanza. So if we were to like rearrange these stanzas, would it really be easy to say that this stanza goes before this stanza or this stanza goes before this stanza? Maybe she helps us out a little bit in that sense with like the progression of the rhyme. But if they're all sort of structured in the same manner, maybe the idea here is that there is this like generalized sense of how to respond to losing that we can apply to our lives, no matter if it's a car key that we're losing or if it's a loved one. that we're losing. And you know, there's no such thing as disaster because all losing is created equal, and it's an art form that you can easily master in how to respond to loss, and it shouldn't really be that hard for us, right? Again, I think we're in the head of the speaker as she tries to convince herself of all of these things. So we get to the last stanza here. Even losing you, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it like disaster. Okay, so this final little couplet, I love this little interjection of the voice in the speaker's head, right? Though it may look like, write it like disaster. So you can imagine where that write it comes from. Okay, I believe that she has probably written this poem to convince herself that the art of losing is not hard to master. So this little write it voice is the reminder that this is what she's doing. She's trying to justify how easy it is to respond to loss by writing a poem about it. And although she may be struggling here at the end with believing in that message, that interjection voice comes back in and is like, remember, you're supposed to write this down, right? Write it, like, keep writing it, right? And just like the villanelle is a form of repetition and reminder and reinforcement, there's that like voice of the conscience repeating, reminding, and reinforcing here at the end of this poem that if she ever wants to cope with losing, she has to write about it, because that's what poets do. That's how they cope with anything. Okay. Now, we get to the end of this poem. Do we agree with Elizabeth Bishop here that the art of losing isn't hard to master? Well, I'm not sure that we're supposed to, right? I think that in part we're meant to like sympathize with the speaker that's struggling with this idea of losing things, but I'm not totally sure that I agree with her, right? That losing is something that's easy to master. I think it's meant to be this sort of tug of war, right, between this voice that's saying, no, it's not easy, and this voice that's saying, oh yeah, it's easy to master this, right? And again, the villanelle form sort of lends itself to that. It's not hard to master. Ooh, it's like a disaster. Oh, it's not hard to master. Ooh, it's like a disaster. Ooh, it's not hard to master. Ooh, it's like a disaster, right? And that struggle, that tension between those two competing sides is really the heart of this poem, and that's really where the use of the villanelle form comes into play, right? The repetition of two key lines kind of gives us that sense of give and take, of tug of war back and forth. And you can imagine somebody trying to overcome an overwhelming loss is probably in a position or in a situation where they're torn between these conflicting ideas, or these ideas that are in tension with one another. And how do we respond to these events? How do we begin to understand these events? How do we order the things that we lose in our lives and understand them better as far as how to respond to them? Tomorrow, tomorrow's election day, and there's going to be a lot of loss. There's a potential for a lot of loss in a lot of different ways tomorrow for election day. So in addition to feeling strongly about one art on a personal level today, I also feel strongly about it as far as Tuesday's election might go. This is something to meditate on, right? How do we deal with these things that we lose? How do we respond to things that might be considered disasters? How do we navigate this tension between moving on and not really feeling like we're able to move on? And one art is a powerful meditation on that tension. Okay, so that's it for today, guys. Go ahead and check your scavenger hunt answer key. Make sure you filled out that survey that I posted on a lesson plan as well. And that's it for today. We'll see you guys tomorrow to talk more about some of these poems. See you guys.